So, the Secunde question 24, Article 9. And it's about this distinction, the figurative, the illuminative, and the unitive way. On this different terms to describe that reality. The way St. Thomas puts it here is, but he talks about charity being divided into 3 degrees: beginning, progress, and perfection. Okay. So as usual, he always begins his articles with objections to the thesis he's going to defend. The first objection: it would seem unfitting to distinguish 3 degrees of charity, beginning, progress, and perfection, for there are many degrees between the beginning of charity and its ultimate perfection. True, it's not right to say there's only 3. Second objection: charity begins to progress as soon as it begins to be. Therefore, we ought not to distinguish between charity as progressing and as beginning. Okay. And it's true. As soon as the charity begins, well, it progresses. If it doesn't progress, then it dies. You will see that, and I'll talk about that. He who does not advance goes backward. It's an adage that all the different authors use. If your charity doesn't get greater, then it's going to disappear. Okay. So there's no distinction, says the objection, between beginning and progressing, because as soon as it begins to be, well, then it's progressing, or it's going to stop being. And the third objection: however perfect a man's charity may be, it can increase. And he said that before in another previous article. That is, charity can always progress. That's why Our Lady's charity always progressed, right to the very end of her life. Our Lord's did it because it was absolutely perfect from the very beginning. It didn't increase in any way in grace. He was always full of grace. But Our Lady wasn't, so her charity was always. Therefore, perfect charity ought not to be distinguished from progressing charity, because even perfect charity is always progressing. So there's no difference. Why are you distinguishing between this third, it's perfect charity and progressing charity? Because it's always progressing. All right, so those are the objections. The objections always kind of get you in the ballpark. They don't kind of figure what were you talking about. And it goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle does the same thing. He says, when you discuss a question, the best thing to start is with just problems or difficulties. Aporia, they say in Greek. And aporia phoros is a word for way, and aporos, it's a negative. It blocks the way. There's on something the way. But that's the way you find out the way. Is by looking at the difficulties in the way. That's how you cut. Again, it kind of gets in the ballpark. So that's what St. Thomas does. It always gives these difficulties, in fact, seem to contradict what he's going to say, if that's what kind of gets you on the track and where you want to go. Okay. Then there's the sed contra. On the contrary. And the sed contra is always an authority, either from Scripture or fathers at church, or sometimes they're philosophers, Aristotle. So this one comes from St. Augustine, his commentary on the first epistle of St. John, where he says, St. Augustine, as soon as charity is born, it takes food, nutritor, which refers to beginners. After taking food, or become nourished, it waxes strong, probratur, in Latin, becomes strong, which refers to those who are progressing. And St. Augustine goes on, when it has become strong, it is perfected. Put it, robarata perficitur. Once it's become strong, it's perfected, which refers to the perfect. Therefore, there are 3 degrees of charity. Okay? And This is not just St. Augustine as this. There's a whole line of writers from the time of Origen, who was in the 3rd century, who talk about these 3 degrees. It's super traditional. So the problem is, well, what does it mean? Everybody talks about it. Well, what does it mean? And Gary Villagrange points out this. St. Thomas really gets to the bottom of it. He explains what what is really going on with these 3 degrees of charity. So, after the sed contra, there's the respondeo, the response. I answer that. So he's going to give his solution because that's what the doctor did, right? Medieval schools, he gave the solution. That's the answer. So I answer that. The spiritual increase of charity may be considered in respect of a certain likeness to the growth of the human body. Okay, so he proposes an analogy between spiritual growth and bodily growth. That's going to be his answer. For although this latter growth of the human body may be divided into many parts, it has certain fixed divisions according to those particular actions or pursuits to which man is brought by this same growth. That sentence is the key to the whole article. So write that down, okay? Because it explains this division in spiritual life, which is sort of the theme of this retreat. So he says, this latter growth, he says, because this is the analogy he's using, the growth of the human body. Now, the growth of the human body is divided into many parts, but it has certain fixed divisions. The growth of the human body has certain fixed divisions. Now, how are they divided? According to those particular actions or pursuits, so divisions according to those particular actions or pursuits, to which man is brought by this same growth. So, divisions according to those particular actions or pursuits to which man is brought by this same growth. That's kind of an intense sentence, but it contains exactly the whole key to everything. So bodily growth has these divisions which are according to the particular actions, pursuits, which man is brought by this same growth. So that as you grow, you do different things. And so this growth has divisions according to the different things you do as you grow. And he gives examples, as he explained, putting what he's talking about. Thus, we speak of a man being an infant until he has the use of reason. Infans means, in Latin, can't talk. Because you can't talk really until you can have something to say. I mean, you can babble and blah, 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 blah. You're an infant until you have the use of reason. With this, for example, you can receive communion, right? When you have the use of reason, we understand what it is to receive. And St. Thomas says, that first act of reason decides at that moment, you either choose for God or you choose against it. Because until that moment, you don't really know what you're doing. I mean, you can be a state of grace if you're baptized. But you haven't really made a moral act yet. Because the moral act, you have to know that, the idea of an ultimate end. You're choosing to act for this ultimate end. That's what it means to make an act of reason. And there's a moment when that happens for the first time, which is, until the end, you're an infant. And then at that moment, you change. And you enter another state, after which we distinguish another state of man where he begins to speak and to use his reason. So infans means you can't speak. Well, once you have the use of reason, you can speak. And then really speak and know what you're saying. Right? After which, while there is again a third state, that of puberty, when he begins to acquire the power of generation. And so arrives at perfection. Well, that's another third division, which if you, when you begin to be able to generate, and so you become a man or a woman. Okay, so that's the division that St. Thomas gives of the bodily growth. Then he applies this analogy to charity, because that's what he wants to talk about. In like manner, the diverse degrees of charity are distinguished according to the different pursuits to which man is brought by the increase of charity. And that's another sentence to write down because it corresponds to what the other one was. In like manner, this is the analogy, bodily growth, charity. Now, in like manner, the diverse degrees of charity are distinguished. How? According to the different pursuits to which man is brought by the increase of charity. Just like bodily growth is distinguished according to different actions that you do. The first one is, before you have the use of reason, and when you begin to have the use of reason, that's where the change happens. And when you begin to be able to generate. So different actions, you're in a different state. And similarly with charity, then the different degrees of charity are distinguished according to different pursuits to which man is brought by the increase of charity. The greater your charity is, you do different things. Okay, so this is sort of the essence of the whole retreat. Charity doesn't do the same thing at the beginning as it does in the middle, as it does at the end. By the increase of charity, you begin to do different things. Just as in bodily growth, the more you grow, you do different things. And you're completely different. And it's the same thing in the spiritual life. And that's really important, as we're going to see. It's literally vital. So he explains what these different pursuits are. For at first, it is incumbent upon man to occupy himself chiefly with avoiding sin and resisting his concupiscences, which move in opposition to charity. So that's the action you're involved in at the beginning, which characterizes this state you're in. Is it you're occupied chiefly with avoiding sin and resisting its concupiscences, to stay out of mortal sin, which would destroy charity in you. So that's the first stage. This concerns beginners, in whom charity has to be fed or fostered, lest it be destroyed, which is what St. Augustine said, right? It's to be. When it has been born, it must be nourished to keep it alive. It doesn't die. In the second place, man's chief pursuit is to aim at progress in good. And this is the pursuit of the proficient. See, it's different it's essentially different between acting in order to avoid sin so that you don't fall into mortal sin and lose charity, and to progress in charity. So these people aim at progressing good, whose chief aim is to strengthen their charity by adding to it, and that's what he's saying from St. Augustine. When it has been nourished, it must wax strong. It has to be stronger. So the concern is not just to avoid losing charity, it's to increase it, make it stronger. While man's third pursuit is to aim chiefly at union with and enjoyment of God. This belongs to the perfect, who desire to be dissolved and to be with Christ, which is a quote from St. Paul. Right? Which again is completely different. It's not just progressing in good. It's aiming at union with God. The example I always think of, maybe because that's what was going on when I was a kid, when they went to the moon. I remember when they first started that, only the first they got a man into orbit. Remember John Glenn? Anybody who was older? That's a big deal. They put this guy and went around him. I don't know. Wow. But later on, then that was the Mercury stage. And then Apollo was when they actually flew and they landed. Well, it's kind of analogous to this whole thing. Getting out of mortal sin is like getting into orbit. And it's a big deal to get into orbit. You got this huge. Remember the rocket that they have to get the blast off. The blast off. Remember Walter Cronkite? Oh, it's postponed. I learned the word postponed. Watching Walter Cronkite, it was Mercury because it's postponed. Well, that means it's not going to happen today. It's going to happen later. Okay, it's postponed. Okay, canceled is a different thing. I learned that too. It's postponed. But anyway, finally there's the day and it blasts off, and it's a big deal. I mean, critical on until it finally gets others. Goes around. See, that's the purgative stage. Got to get out of sin. It's a big deal. And that's, what made these Ignatian retreats. To get Spanish soldiers out of sin. And it's not easy. Is there embedded in sin. And you have to scare the hell out of them. Literally. To get them out of hell. To get them up in the state of grace. Once you get there, well, you don't go get completely different thing. It's much more subtle in a way. It's not just muscles. The main thing is direction. Because they get the thing going faster, it's faster, so it gets out of orbit, and then they got to make sure it's going in the right direction. And they go to Mars or somewhere. I mean, that's like be lost in space, right? So it's a completely different thing. And that's what the illuminative way is like. It's not just, blasting off. You're not blasting on anymore. You're not getting out of sin, the state of grace. Now you have to progress and go where you're supposed to go. You have to get your radar working. And a lot of it is, there is, you have to go and you have to get going really fast to get out of the reverse gravity to get going, right? That's sort of the first part of the progressive, illuminative way to increase the charity so that you can get out of orbit. And that's when you get into the contemplative state. We'll talk about that later. Meditation, contemplation. You need to meditate at the beginning, but there's a time when you just have to let go. And that's how you progress. Is by letting go and letting God do it. But he can't do it too fast. You have to wait until he takes over. Until he does, and you have to keep going. When he does intervene, then you have to let go. And it's a different thing completely than the purgative life. Okay. You start again, see the idea I'm talking about? And that's why it's not always the same thing. In fact, it's completely different. It's even opposite sometimes. Then there's a final stage when they actually get to the moon. Oh, that's completely different again. Because it's no longer just, going towards the moon. Now you have to land. And that's a whole other problem. And that corresponds to the unitive way when you're uniting with God. You've arrived, now it's not. It's completely different. There's a whole different series, steps that they have to do. NASA, figure out how to, get this thing on the ground without crashing. Okay? And that's in the spiritual life, that's true as well. Not the same thing. In a way, it's completely different. Okay, so he finishes the corpus, his response, saying, in like manner, we observe in local motion that first there is withdrawal from one term, then approach to the other term, and thirdly, rest in this term. Which is like, it's 3 different things. So then he responds to the objections. The first one was, why there's 3? Why not? It's supposed to be degrees of charity. Why you only make 3? Answer: all these distinct degrees, which can be discerned in the increase of charity, are comprised in the aforesaid 3. Even as every division of continuous things is included in these 3, the beginning, the middle, and the end, as the philosopher states. A pretty simple answer, but that's, it's true. And every motion, there's the beginning, the end, well, there's what's in between. Okay? So we said St. Thomas is hard. Simple. Nothing to it. And there's even Aristotle that said that. So, second objection: charity, as soon as it begins, progresses. So why distinguish beginning and progressive? Answer: although those who are beginners in charity may progress, yet the chief care that besets them is to resist the sins which disturb them by their onslaught. So these degrees, it's a matter of what is more prominent at that moment. The chief care at the beginning is to stay out of sin. The true, you progress in the truth. As soon as you begin to have charity, you progress. Because if you don't, you stop, you lose it. But the chief care at the beginning is to stay out of sin, even if you are progressing. The main thing that you're doing is trying to stay out of sin. Afterwards, however, when they come to feel this onslaught of sins less, they begin to tend to perfection with greater security. Okay, so in that, once, as time goes on and you progress, your main concern is no longer in staying out of sin, but it's to tend to perfection. Yet with one hand doing the work, while the other hand holds the sword. Actually related in the book of Esdras about those who built up Jerusalem. If you ever read the book of Esdras, it talks about when the Jews came back from exile and they had to build the walls of Jerusalem, would have been destroyed to protect themselves from the enemies. They had to have one hand with the sword to protect themselves from these enemies, another one the trowel to make the wall. It's a perfect example of what he's trying to explain here, because it's while you're progressing in charity, at the same time you have to defend yourself from losing it. Okay, but as time goes on, the more once you got the wall built, once you progress, well, then you don't have to have that sword all the time because you got a wall. So once you build up your virtue, then you don't have to worry about falling into sin so much. I mean, you always have to worry about falling into sin in a way, but it's not as important. It becomes it's not your chief pursuit anymore, as it was in the beginning. Okay, so that's a distinction between these different ways. It's a matter of what your chief pursuit is. Because even when you're in the unitive way, it's possible to fall into sin, but it's not what you worry about all the time. You worry about this union with God. Finally, the third objection was, so no matter how perfect man's charity is, it's always progressing. So there's no distinction between progressing and perfection. Answer: even the perfect make progress in charity. Yet this is not their chief care, but their aim is principally directed towards union with God. And though both the beginner and the proficient seek this, yet their solicitude is chiefly about other things, with the beginner about avoiding sin, and with the proficient about progressing virtue. So you see, the distinction is according to what you're chiefly worried about. Okay, even if all three are happening at the same time. So when you're going to the moon, you're still progressing. You're getting closer to the moon, right? But I mean, what you're really worried about, how in the world am I going to land this thing? Even though you're progressing, okay, but that's not what you're worried about. Is how am I going to land thing? You did. Now, St. Catherine of Siena has this image that she uses about the bridge. I don't know if you ever heard of that. She said, being in mortal sin is like somebody who's in the river. And you're in this river and it's going and it's going to fall. It means it falls. And then you're going to go into hell. That's the river. Someone is mortal. We said, someone who managed to get out of mortal sin is like someone who's gotten out of the river. They stopped. They got back. They've gotten into state of grace. They're no longer in the river. That's going to go and fall into hell. But she says, once you got out of the river, you have to get up on the bridge, which is Christ, and go to God, or you will inevitably fall back into the river. Okay. You have the bridge, which is Christ, which is his proficiency in virtue, so that you can arrive to union with God. If you don't get up on the bridge, which is Christ, you're going to fall back in the river. And he who does not progress, regresses. So that's the way she puts it. So to go back to that image that I had, I'll start somewhat about this. Some people kind of get stuck in the spiritual life because they stay in that first sort of stage and they think that's sort of all there is. And then they get frustrated, thinking, well, he kind of tied himself up in knots. It's like, thinking, well, there's no point in me going to a retreat or joining the Third Order or something like that. Because, I'm struggling with this staying out of mortal sin all the time. And, I can't imagine doing anything else. See, that's a false way of looking at things, because getting out of mortal sin is like sort of being in reverse. You got to get in reverse. Get out of mortal sin. So you think about hell and like fleeing hell. I don't want to go to hell. So I'm going to get in state of grace because I don't want to go to hell. Well, okay, that's good. Like for these Spanish soldiers, that's what they have to do, because, you can't preach to them about, the duties of flying union or something. And that's not going to do anything to them. You've got to scare them because of where they're going. And they get, they stop sitting because they don't want to go to hell. But that's like going in reverse. But the theologians say that's not enough to even save your soul, really. Because that's just fear. It's a good thing. But to be in the state of grace, you've got to love God yourself. You can't just be servile here. You can't get into heaven by just backing off. And it doesn't work anyway. You can't get anywhere by backing up. So if you go to Topeka and going backing up, you're going to probably have an accident. You're going to go in the ditch, or you might hit something, you can't back up into heaven. You can't get to heaven by just running away from hell. You got to turn around at some point. Sometimes you have to back up, right, to get out. But then you have to turn around and start going towards God. And at the beginning, it's in low gear. It's, you don't just fly right away going, God, But you start that way. I mean, I know in our grain trucks back on the farm, you got what they call bull low. Because, when you have a truck full of grain, like it weighs a few tons of, it's heavy. So you just can't, put it in here and just take off. You've got a number of gears. And the first one, we call it full low, because it's the you just get going. It's not going very fast, but to get the thing moving, it's so heavy, you got to go slowly at the beginning to get it going. Then once you get going enough, then you can put into second. And then into third. After you go into town, the fourth gear. But it doesn't happen all at once, right? So there's reverse, below, and then there's, higher gears. And this spiritual life is the same thing, I say. It's just, and you have these different pursuits that you do at different times. And sometimes they're completely different and even opposite, as we're going to see. You've heard that praise of St. John in his letter. Perfect charity casts out fear. If you remember. So fear is necessary at the beginning. Fear of God fear of the Lord is beginning wisdom, right? It's the beginning. It's the beginning, but it's the beginning. There is a fear of the Lord, in fact, that exists even in heaven, right? But it's not the servile fear. Servile fear is cast out. Perfect love casts out fear. And you see, at a certain point in the spiritual life, you progress by not fearing anymore. That's been before. And that blocks it. Beast can tell you, that blocks a lot of people. They don't progress because they just fear. It's fear that stops them from progress. Because they've maybe done too many Ignatian retreats. I mean, it happens. It's not, the priests have to be careful of that when they preach. And some people, they tell them, you can't go, scrupulous people can't do those retreats. Because it just destroys them completely. So this is a quote from Scripture, which kind of sets the tone for this little retreat. It's from Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. It's also called Clelet. It's that short book. It begins, vanity of vanity, all vanity, that book. Now, you may recognize all the older, those of older ones, and that's not new anymore. Peter, Paul, and Mary, all things have a time. Well, it comes from here. Got it from Scripture. All things have their season. And in their times, all things pass under heaven. Okay, so remember that. All things have their season. And the spiritual life is true. And it's really important. It's vital. All things have their season, and in their times, all things pass under heaven. There's a chapter 3, verse 1 to 8 in Ecclesiastes. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to destroy and a time to build. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to scatter stones and a time to gather them. A time to embrace and a time to be far from embraces. A time to get and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. A time to rend and a time to sow. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time of love and a time of hatred. A time of war and a time. Okay. So, to begin, we're going to talk about the whole idea of the spiritual life itself. Like, what is it? And that's what this book of Vergil Grunch down does, okay? But first of all, I'll just read you a part from that other work of his called The 3 Ages of the Entire Life. It's too much bigger, the 2-volume sets. At the beginning, he has a chapter where he talks about the interior life itself. It explains what it is. As soon as a man ceases to be outwardly occupied to talk with his fellow men, as soon as he is alone, even in the noisy streets of a great city, he begins to carry on a conversation with himself. He is young, he often thinks of his future. If he is old, he thinks of the past. And his happy or unhappy experience of life makes him usually judge persons and events very differently. If a man is fundamentally egotistical, his intimate conversation with himself is inspired by sensuality or pride. He converses with himself about the object of his cupidity, of his envy. Finding therein sadness and death, he tries to flee from himself, to live outside of himself, to divert himself in order to forget the emptiness and the nothingness of his life. I don't know if you've ever read Pascal's Pensées. He talks about what he calls diversion. People do anything to forget their misery, the fact that they're fundamentally very unhappy. And we see that everywhere today. Something over here. Listen to something. Walk out the silence. He is acquainted especially with the sensitive part of his soul, that part which is common to man and to the animal. Thus he has sensible joys, sensible sorrows, according as whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, as he wins money or loses it. He has desires and aversions of the same sensible order. And when he is opposed, he has moments of impatience and anger prompted by inordinate self-love. But the egoist knows little about the spiritual part of his soul, that which is common to the angel and to man. Even if he believes in the spirituality of the soul and of the higher faculties, intellect and will, he does not live in the spiritual order. He does not, so to speak, know experimentally this higher part of himself. And he does not love it sufficiently. If he knew it, he would find in it the image of God, and he would begin to love himself, not in an egotistical manner for himself, but for God. His thoughts almost always fall back on what is inferior in him. And though he often shows intelligence and cleverness, which may even become craftiness and cunning, his intellect, instead of rising, always inclines toward what is inferior to it. It's made to contemplate God, the supreme truth, and often dallies in error, sometimes obstinately defending the error by every means. It's been said that if life is not on a level with thought, thought ends by descending to the level of life. All declines and one's highest convictions gradually go weaker. The intimate conversation of the egoist with himself proceeds thus to death, and is therefore not an interior life. Its self-life, love, leads him to wish to make himself the center of everything, to draw everything to himself, both persons and things. Since this is impossible, he frequently ends in disillusionment and disgust. He becomes unbearable to himself and to others and ends by hating himself, because he wished to love himself excessively. At times he ends by hating life because he desired too greatly what is inferior to it, in it. If a man who is not in the state of grace begins to seek goodness, his intimate conversation with himself is already quite different. He converses with himself, for example, about what is necessary to live becomingly and to support his family. This at times preoccupies him greatly. He feels his weakness and the need of placing confidence no longer in himself alone, but in God. While still in the state of mortal sin, this man may have Christian faith and hope, which subsist even in us even after the loss of charity, as long as we have not sinned mortally by incredulity, despair, or presumption. When this is so, this man's intimate conversation with himself is occasionally illumined by the supernatural light of faith. Now and then he thinks of eternal life and desires it, although this desire remains weak. He's sometimes led by a special inspiration to enter a church to pray. Finally, if this man has at least attrition for his sins, which means fear of sin because of the fear of hell, and receives absolution for them, he recovers the state of grace and charity, the love of God and neighbor, because That's a doctrine in moral theology. And confession, attritus fit contritus. That's what the grace of confession does. Some can have attrition, which means they're sorry for sin because of the fear of hell. Well, that won't get you, you're not in the state of grace yet, like as I said. That's not, you have no love of God. You're just loving yourself. That's a good love of yourself. But it's not, it's not yet charity. You're not in the state of grace. But if you go with that kind of fear of attrition to confession, that's what the grace of confession does. It makes you pass from being just sorry for your sin because of your fear of hell to being sorry for sin out of love of God. Therefore, when he is alone, his intimate conversation with himself changes. He begins to love himself in a holy manner, not for himself, but for God, and to love his own for God. He begins to understand that he must pardon his enemies and love them, to wish eternal life for them as he does for himself. Often, however, the intimate conversation of a man in the state of grace continues to be tainted with egoism, self-love, sensuality, and pride. These sins are no longer mortal in him. They are venial, but if they are repeated, they incline him to fall into a serious sin, that is to fall back into spiritual death. Should this happen, this man tends again to flee from himself, because what he finds in himself is no longer life but death. Instead of making a salutary reflection on the subject, he may hurl himself back further into death by casting himself into pleasure, the satisfaction of sensuality and pride. In man's hour of solitude, this intimate conversation begins again in spite of everything, as if to prove to him that it cannot stop. He would like to interrupt it, yet he cannot do so. The center of the soul is an irrestrainable need which demands satisfaction. In reality, God alone can answer this need, and the only solution is straightway to take the road leading to him. The soul must converse with someone other than itself. Why? Because it is not its own last end. Because its end is the living God and cannot rest entirely except in him. As St. Augustine puts it, our heart is restless until it repose in thee. So in the other book, the one that we're going to use for the retreat, Father Gardner explains this paramount importance of the interior life. And St. Zabala wrote a book about that, with the interior castle, if you ever read it. It's not an easy book, but it's, very good. She talks about that. So the interior life is for all the one thing necessary. Where's that come from? There's one thing necessary. From the gospel. Where? Nobody recognizes it? Rings a bell? We had it recently in the liturgy on the feast of St. Martha. Martha, remember our Lord telling Martha, she's laying around studying and get Mary to help her. So Martha, you worry yourself about many things. One thing is necessary. One thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the better path. But the one thing necessary. Which is love of God, right? That's what she chose, right? She was staying there to feed him. He wouldn't take that away from her to go and work with Martha. She chose there's one thing necessary. You worry yourself about many things, but one thing is necessary. Martha. I was like a Martha, because that's what's going on with Martha. She's divided. Martha. That's Martha. Martha. See, that's the whole point with the active life. It's Martha. Mary is just one. The one thing necessary. You said was the love of God? Just the one. Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess you could say that. Yeah. This interior life. The interior life is for all the one thing necessary. It ought to be constantly developing in our souls, more so than what we call our intellectual life, more so than our scientific, artistic, or literary life. The interior life is lit in the depths of the soul. That's the phrase that we're going to read or listen to some John Tauler, a Dominican 14th century spiritual writer, is quoted by everybody. And he preached often to Dominican contemplative nuns. And they're beautiful, beautiful sermons. And so we're going to read, or after we listen to excerpts from his sermons, which I recorded for another retreat, so that way nobody will have to read, be able to just listen after we finish the book. I'll call it this year. But he talks about the depths of the soul. The interior life is lived in the depths of the soul. It is the life of the whole man, not merely of one or other of his faculties. Pierre Soule talks about that as well. I say the moral good is not just, the good of the intellect. For example, some people think, well, that's good itself, but it's not. It perfects. You can perfect your intellect and be a great scientist or something, but that's not the attitude. Moral good is the good that is for the whole man, which means that it fulfills the will, which is not, the intellect is not just, the whole good of man is not just the good of the intellect. It's the will as the object of the whole good of man. It is life of the whole man, not merely one or other of his faculties. This interior life. The pressing need of devoting ourselves to the consideration of the one thing necessary is especially manifest in these days of general chaos and unrest. When so many men and nations, neglecting their true destiny, give themselves up entirely to acquiring earthly possessions, failing to realize how inferior these are to the everlasting riches of the Spirit. This book was written in between the two wars. So you notice Gary often refers to fact. He lived through it. It is all the more important to recall the necessity and the true nature of the interior life, because the true conception of it, as given to us in the Gospel, in the epistles of St. Paul, and in the Holy Tradition, has been partially obscured by many false ideas. In particular, it is evident that the notion of the interior life is radically corrupted in the Lutheran theory of justification or conversion. So Gerhard is not very ecumenical. He attacks Luther all the time. And it's vital. And our good Pope Francis always talks about how great Luther is. He even put a statue of him at the Vatican. But John Paul II, he visited, I remember when I was on, he visited the Lutheran temple and preached. Well, anyway, this is what he's going to, and he's just going to say what Luther said, and how it's abominable. It's against all the fundamental good of man, which is his spiritual life. Thirdly, is evident that the notion of interior life is radically corrupted in the Lutheran theory of justification and conversion. According to this theory, the mortal sins of the convert are not positively blotted out by the infusion of the new life of grace and charity. They are simply covered over, veiled by faith in the Redeemer, and they cease to be imputed to the person who has committed them. There is no intrinsic justification, no interior renewal of the soul. A man is reputed just merely by the extrinsic imputation of the justice of God, of Christ. Okay, you've probably heard that before. That's what they think. These famous phrases, sin bravely and believe even more bravely. Because it's not your justice that saves you, it's your faith in Christ. So it really have this idea that, within. Pardon? Oh, is it open? Can you come in? Okay. Come in. We're just talking about Luther. That's your floor. Speak of the devil. And that was the main Lutheran doctrine that was, well, at least a fundamental Lutheran doctrine that was condemned by the Council of Trent, which said that it's grace is something real in your soul. For Luther, grace is just an exterior imputation of the merits of Christ on your soul. You stay a sinner, but the blood of Christ covers your sins veiled by your faith. But you don't change. Grace is not something real in you, is what Luther says. Whereas the church teaches grace is something real in you. You are not just imputed to be just. You become just by the grace of God that's in your soul. That changes you. And that's the difference. So that's what you talk. This whole light of grace that's in our soul. If it were true that by conversion sins were only veiled and not blotted out, it would follow that a man is at once both just and ungodly, both justified and yet still in the state of sin, and which is what Luther said. He said you can be just, you're just and you're a sinner at the same time. Because you're just for invitation and you're a sinner in yours. God looks at you as if you're just because you remain. God would love the sinner as his friend, despite the corruption of this soul, which is apparently incapable of healing. The Savior would not have taken away the sins of the world if he had not delivered the just man from the servitude of sin. Yeah, the Bible. The whole Lamb of God who taketh away the sins of the world. He didn't just come. The blotting out and remission of sins, thus described in the Scriptures, can be effected only by the infusion of sanctifying grace and charity, which is the supernatural love of God and of men for God's sake. Ezekiel, speaking in the name of God, tells us that this is so. I will pour upon you clean water, and you shall be cleansed from all your filthiness, and I will cleanse you from all your idols, and I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh and will give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in the midst of you, and I will cause you to walk like men. Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 25. It's in the Bible. If it were otherwise, God's uncreated love for the man whom he converts would be merely an idle affection and not an effective and offered love. But God's uncreated love for us, as St. Thomas shows, is a love which, far from presupposing in us any lovableness, actually produces that lovableness within us. St. Thomas has a whole article on this precise point, and he refutes Luther like 3 centuries before Luther was ever, which is why the Council of Trent, put Summa on the altar when you set for the Council of Trent, along with the Bible.